How many legendary cars were made using parts nicked from ordinary everyday models? Well, it turns out the answer is absolutely loads. But car makers weren't just being lazy. It's actually really expensive to develop completely unique parts like headlights, brake lights and switches. So sometimes it's easier to buy these from another brand instead. But some legendary car makers are guilty of borrowing parts too. So in this video, I'm going to show you my pick of the 13 coolest cars that were put together using borrowed parts. I'm Matt Watson and you're watching CarWow.
Buying a new car? Then head to CarWow and my team will help you find your next car at a fair price. CarWow, your one-stop car buying comparison site.
The McLaren F1 is one of the most famous cars ever, but McLaren was so busy making sure it was the fastest car in the world that it didn't have time to build its own parts. So F1 prototypes came with mirrors from a Citroen CX, and the production cars got their mirrors from a Volkswagen Corrado. The F1's majestic V12 engine wasn't made by McLaren either. It was loosely based on one in a BMW 850 CSI. But the McLaren F1's greatest crime is those distinctive rear lights. Now, do they remind you of something? Well, they're actually off a Bova Futara, which is a bus. Lotus used to have a reputation for pretty dodgy reliability, but that's not really fair because Lotus uses loads of parts from other manufacturers, so it can't all be Lotus's fault. The first Lotus Europa from the 60s had exactly the same chrome bumpers as a Ford Anglia, and the original Elise had a 1.8 litre engine pinched from the MG ZR and Rover 25. Even the super cool Esprit borrowed a load of parts from cheaper cars, like the brake lights that came from a Toyota AE86 and the gearbox that Lotus got from a Renault 25. Even today, the latest Lotus Elise uses a 4-cylinder engine from an older Toyota Corolla, and the Exige has a supercharged version of the previous Toyota Camry's V6. So at least those engines should be reliable then, eh? Aston Martin builds some of the most luxurious cars in the world these days, but it's not above borrowing parts from other cars. Take the Vantage and the DBX for example. These both come with V8 engines made by AMG. But AMG is not exactly a budget brand, is it? It's not like Aston got its engines from Ford or something like that, is it? Well, actually, it did once. Back in the 90s when it was making the DB7. That car's 5.9 litre V12 was actually made from two Ford Mondeo V6s welded together. Okay, so Aston did do a lot of work to re-engineer these engines to make them work as one unit. But that's not the only thing Aston Martin has borrowed. The DB7's rear lights came from the Mazda 323F. Maybe that's why James Bond never drove a DB7. The DMC DeLorean is a cultural icon because it starred in the Back to the Future movies, but it was actually a pretty terrible car. It was originally going to have a Ford engine, but DeLorean ran out of cash, so it had to settle for a 2.8 litre V6 called the PRV. Now PRV stands for Peugeot, Renault, Volvo. So it was the same engine that you got in the ultra-dull Volvo 240 and 260. That's a sort of car driven by history teachers, not time travellers. The Jaguar XJ220 used to be the fastest car in the world back in the early 90s, but it was made using some bits from really boring cars. The wing mirrors came from a Citroen CX, and the brake lights were off an R8. Not an Audi R8, that hadn't come out yet. I'm talking about the R8 generation of Rover 200. And the Jag's V6 engine came from a Mini Metro. Okay, so not a normal Metro, it was the 550 horsepower twin turbo engine from a Metro rally car. So I guess that's fair enough. Do you remember the MG SV? Well, it was a mad looking hot rod that MG cooked up in the early noughties. It had a lightweight carbon fibre body, which actually looked pretty cool. But then MG spoiled it by slapping on some headlights from a Fiat Punto. And MG didn't stop there because the SV's brake lights came off another Fiat. This time the imaginatively named Fiat Coupe. At least the engine was a bit more exciting. The next car on my list is the Pagani Zonda. Right, really? Pagani is all about like unique handmade details and stuff like that. You know, it's so bespoke, that car. Surely they didn't just steal a bunch of cheap parts to build the Zonda, right? Well, take a look at those climate controls. Know what they're off? That's a Rover 45. Bit embarrassing really. Morgan is no stranger to using other brands' engines. The new Plus 6 uses the same B58 3 litre straight 6 engine as found in the M440i and the Toyota Supra. And the Morgan 3-wheeler comes with a 2 litre V-twin S&S motorbike engine and a Mark III Mazda MX-5 gearbox. That's the NC model for all you Mazda nerds. But Morgan hasn't just borrowed oily bits over the years, because the Aeromax and Aero SS both use brake lights from a Lancia Thesis. And the first Morgan Aero 8 used the headlights from a Volkswagen Beetle, although these looked a bit weird, so Morgan eventually fitted headlights from a Mini instead. Lamborghini knows how to make a good-looking car, like the Miura and the Diablo. Awesome things. But some versions of the Miura use the same brake light and headlight covers as a Fiat 850 Spider. And when Lamborghini facelifted the Diablo in the late 90s, it gave it headlights from a Nissan 300ZX. A Lamborghini built with Nissan parts. Although, for the geeks amongst you, you'll like this fact, those headlights also came on the Nissan R390 GT1, which was a road-going version of Nissan's Le Mans racing car. So, you know, it's not all bad. Noble is a tiny sports car maker from the UK, but it made some cracking cars over the years, most notably with bits borrowed from other cars. The Noble M12 came with Ford Mondeo brake lights, and it used that car's 2.5 litre V6 engine as well, although Noble did bolt on 2 massive turbos. After this, Noble made another car called the M600, which had a 4.4 litre twin-turbo V8 built by Yamaha. You know, the people that make superbikes and grand pianos. Now that sounds like a pretty cool recipe, except that Yamaha got the engine block from a Volvo XC90, and that's not quite so cool. Ford is one of the biggest car makers in the world, and the GT40 is one of the most famous cars ever. This mid-engine supercar was built to upset Ferrari by winning the Le Mans 24-hour race, which it did back in 1966, and then for quite a few years later. But this mid-engine monster originally used the brake lights pinched from a Simca 1000. Now you probably don't know what a Simca 1000 is. Well, it was basically a small, cheap rear-engine saloon from France, like a French version of the original Volkswagen Beetle. The next car on this list is going to cause an argument. Porsche fanboys not only hate it when you say Porsche instead of Porsche, they also hate it when you say the 924 has the engine from a Volkswagen van. Some of them will say, listen, that's just lies, it's all made up, it's not true. But actually, it's not a lie. The 924's 2-litre 4-cylinder engine started life in an Audi 100 before Porsche tuned it to make a heady 125 horsepower. But Audi also gave this engine to Volkswagen, who detuned it and stuck it in the LT van. So the 924 didn't use exactly the same engine as a Volkswagen van, but it definitely shared a few bits. Porsche is still sharing engines with other brands these days because the latest Panamera uses the same 4-litre twin-turbo V8 as you get in an Audi RS6. And I've actually raced those two cars head to head, and if you want to find out which is the quickest, I'm going to put a link, she'll be popping out in the top right hand corner of the screen. If you click on that, you can go watch the video. Alternatively, there is the link in the description. Koenigsegg makes some of the fastest hypercars of the 21st century, but some of its early cars, like the CC8S, came with a version of Ford's tried and tested V8 engine. Now sure, Koenigsegg's engineers bored it out to 4.7 litres and tuned it up and fitted a supercharger so it made more than 660 horsepower, but it was still based on the same engine you got in a Ford Crown Victoria. Later, Koenigsegg had their own bespoke 5-litre V8 engines, but the savvy Swedes were still using some borrowed parts, like the Mazda RX-7 bumper reflectors on the CCX. I guess old habits die hard. I hope you'll enjoy the video. If you did, please give it a like. If you click on those windows there, you can watch some more videos. And if you click on that box there, you can download the CarWow app where you can browse all our reviews, our videos, you can compare cars and see how much you can save on a new car. It also includes a special car valuation tool where you can use your phone's camera to scan a car's number plate and it'll tell you how much that car is worth. Download it, it's free.